bleach copper, and the suffocating scent of an alpha mafia boss. Survival for a suppressed Omega Maid meant blending into the wallpaper, ignoring the syndicate blood money paying the wages. But when you're standing inches from a ruthless alpha pulling his silk tie tight and you catch his driver chambering around in the courtyard, survival changes shape. You don't get a medal for pulling a monster off the execution block. You just get dragged directly into his cage. Bleach lemon polish and the faint metallic tang of his own medicated sweat. Those were the smells that anchored Jesse's reality. He preferred them over the cloying synthetic pheromones pumped through the city's underground clubs, and he certainly preferred them over the sharp territorial musk of the men who walked the halls of the Gallagher estate. Jesse kept his hands raw. He spent his mornings scrubbing at the grout of the Italian marble floors until his knuckles ached, focusing on the physical friction to drown out the low-grade persistent hum of his biology. He wore the standard estate uniform, stiff black trousers, a white button-down shirt heavily starched at the collar, and a flat black vest. It was a garment designed to erase the wearer, to make him a ghost. That suited Jesse perfectly. Ghosts didn't get cornered in the pantry. Ghosts didn't get dragged into the brutal blood-stained politics of the Gallagher family. It was a Tuesday. Tuesdays meant Roman Gallagher had his weekly sit-down with the dock unions, which meant the entire house was vibrating with a specific highly combustible tension. Jesse stood by the heavy oak credenza near the front entrance, a dust cloth gripped loosely in his left hand. His right hand reached up, fingers brushing against the edge of the thick flesh-colored patch adhered to the juncture of his neck and shoulder. The suppressant patch burned. It always did. The chemical compound leaked into his bloodstream, effectively neutralizing his omega scent, and replacing it with the dull, flat odor of sterile gauze and nothingness. It tasted like tin in the back of his throat. It made his joints ache and his temper run short, but it kept him employed. More importantly, it kept him invisible in a house entirely populated by apex predators. Heavy footsteps sounded at the top of the grand staircase. Jesse didn't look up, but his body reacted. A microscopic tightening of the spine. A shallow breath pulled in and held. Roman Gallagher descended the stairs. He didn't walk so much as displace the air around him. Roman was a massive man built with the dense, unforgiving architecture of a heavyweight fighter entirely at odds with the bespoke charcoal gray three-piece suits he poured himself into. The air in the foyer immediately shifted, growing thick with the scent of ozone dark roasted coffee and an underlying violence that smelled faintly of copper. It wasn't a scent meant to attract. It was a scent meant to dominate. Jesse kept his eyes fixed on a smudge on the credenza. He rubbed at it with his cloth. "Where the hell is Martin?" Roman's voice was a low rumble, rough with sleep and irritation. It scraped against the cavernous walls of the foyer. Martin was the head valet, a beta, who normally hovered around Roman like an anxious pilot fish. "Called in sick, Mr. Gallagher." A security guard grunted from his post by the double doors. "Stomach flu. Sent word at 4 this morning." Roman swore softly. He reached the bottom of the stairs, stopping in the center of the foyer. He was shrugging on his suit jacket, his movements stiff. Jesse risked a brief sidelong glance. Roman's left shoulder was notoriously bad shattered by a rival family's bullet 3 years ago, and poorly healed. On damp mornings, or mornings where the stress was thick enough to chew the alpha's hands, possessed a slight betraying tremor. Right now, Roman was staring down at the length of dark blue silk hanging limply around his neck. He tried to loop it, his thick fingers clumsy against the delicate fabric. He pulled it too tight, cursed and yanked it loose again, his jaw ticking. The scent of ozone in the room spiked, growing sharp and suffocating. The guard by the door shifted uncomfortably, his own alpha instincts bristling against the localized aggression, but he kept his mouth shut. Roman yanked the silk again, knotting it into an ugly, uneven lump. He glared at himself in the antique mirror hanging above the credenza. He looked tired. Deep, bruised shadows lived under his pale eyes, and the harsh morning light caught the silver threads multiplying at his temples. He looked like a man who was drowning in his own power. "You." Jesse froze. The cloth stopped moving against the wood. "The maid. Kid. Whatever you are." Roman's voice didn't rise in volume, but it carried absolute authority. Fix this, before I strangle myself with it. Jesse swallowed the dry, metallic lump in his throat. He turned, keeping his posture submissive but not cowering. Cowering drew the wrong kind of attention. He walked the 5 paces, bridging the gap between his safe corner and the center of the Alpha's gravity. "Yes, sir," Jesse muttered. His voice was deliberately flat-stripped of any melodic Omega inflection. He stepped into Roman's personal space. The heat radiating off the man was immense, like standing too close to an open furnace. Jesse kept his eyes focused squarely on Roman's chest, refusing to look up into his face. He raised his hands, his raw, slightly calloused fingers brushing against the lapels of the charcoal suit. Roman went perfectly still. The sudden absolute immobility of a predator assessing a touch. Jesse unraveled the ruined knot. The silk slipped smoothly through his fingers, a stark contrast to his rough skin. He didn't think about the man wearing the tie. He thought about the mechanics of the fabric. Cross the wide end over the narrow. Bring it up and through the loop. "You smell like a hospital," Roman muttered suddenly. Jesse didn't flinch, though his stomach bottomed out. "Standard issue suppressants, sir. A state policy for domestic staff. It's giving me a headache." Roman grumbled, though he didn't pull away. He actually leaned in a fraction of an inch, as if unconsciously seeking whatever natural scent lay buried under the chemicals. Jesse held his breath, pulling the silk down to form the base of a half Windsor. He smoothed the edges, his knuckles inadvertently dragging against the crisp white cotton of Roman's shirt, feeling the hard, unyielding muscle of the Alpha's chest beneath it. A sick, contradictory thrill spiked through Jesse's nerve endings, a biological response he instantly violently repressed. He hated his body for it. He hated this house. He pulled the knot up to the collar, tightening it with a swift, efficient tug. As he did, his gaze naturally lifted, looking past Roman's broad shoulder, straight through the reinforced glass of the front windows. Outside, the cobblestone courtyard was bathed in the harsh, flat light of early morning. The estate's heavily armored town car idled by the fountain exhaust, pluming white in the crisp air. Leaning against the rear passenger door was Donovan Royce. Donovan was Roman's personal driver and head of transit security. An alpha, though one who carried the greasy, sour mint scent of a man who constantly chewed nicotine gum and harbored quiet resentments. Jesse had always kept a wide berth of Donovan. The man's eyes lingered too long on the younger staff, and his smiles never reached his dead calculating eyes. From where Jesse stood inches from Roman, he had a perfect framed view of the courtyard. Donovan wasn't just waiting. He was looking around, a casual, sweeping glance that checked the perimeter walls, the guard towers, the front door. It was the look of a man making sure he wasn't being watched. Satisfied, Donovan turned his body slightly toward the blacked-out window of the car, shielding his hands from the estate's exterior cameras. But he couldn't shield them from the foyer window. Jesse's hand stalled on Roman's tie. His breath hitched a tiny, fractured sound in the quiet space. Through the glass, Jesse watched Donovan pull a compact suppressed pistol from his shoulder holster. It wasn't his standard-issue security sidearm. This was a ghost gun, matte black, devoid of serial numbers, with a heavy cylindrical silencer attached to the barrel. Donovan didn't just check it. He racked the slide back a fraction of an inch, a brass check ensuring a round was chambered. He tapped the magazine to ensure it was seated flush. Then, with a practiced, terrifying fluidity, he slid the weapon not back into his holster, but into the deep side pocket of his overcoat. He kept his hand resting casually inside the pocket, his thumb undoubtedly resting on the safety. Donovan looked up, his gaze fixing squarely on the front doors, waiting for his boss to walk out. Jesse felt a cold, paralyzing dread pour down his spine. It felt like ice water in his veins. The world tunneled, the edges of his vision bleeding out, until all he could see was the shape of the gun in the driver's pocket. This wasn't a bodyguard preparing for external threats. Bodyguards kept their weapons holstered until a threat presented itself. Bodyguards didn't use illicit suppressors on domestic soil unless they were trying to muffle a shot meant to go unnoticed. Donovan was going to kill Roman. The moment Roman stepped into the back of that car, before the doors even closed, Donovan would turn and put a quiet, suppressed hollow point into his skull. "Are you done? Or do you plan on choking me?" Roman's voice snapped Jesse back to the present. Jesse blinked. He was still holding the edges of Roman's collar, his knuckles white with tension. The silence in the foyer was suddenly deafening. The security guard by the door shifted his weight, his boots squeaking against the marble. Jesse let go of the tie as if it were a live wire. He smoothed his hands down his sides, wiping his sweaty palms against his trousers. His mind was running 1,000 calculations a second. If Roman died, the Gallagher syndicate would fracture. The resulting power vacuum would trigger a bloodbath across the city. The rival families would swarm the estate within hours. The staff, the Omegas, the Betas, the low-level grunts would be slaughtered to tie up loose ends or sold off to the highest bidder. Jesse had spent 3 years meticulously building his invisible life here. He had a bank account. He had a lock on his bedroom door. He had a precarious, fragile safety built on the assumption that Roman Gallagher was an immovable object. If Roman got in that car, Jesse's life was over. But if Jesse spoke up, he was stepping out of the shadows. He was inserting himself into Mafia business. Informants didn't live long, healthy lives. If he was wrong, Roman would have him skinned for paranoia and delaying his schedule. If he was right, Roman would want to know how he knew why he was watching, and suddenly Jesse wouldn't be an invisible maid anymore. He would be an asset. And being an asset in this family was just a slower death sentence. "Done, sir." Jesse whispered, his voice trembling slightly despite his desperate attempt to control it. Roman narrowed his eyes. The Alpha leaned back, evaluating the Omega standing before him. Roman was many things: a killer and extortionist, a ruthless bastard, but he wasn't blind. He noticed the sudden pallor of Jesse's skin. He noticed the way the scent of pure, unadulterated fear briefly overpowered the hospital bleach reek of the suppressants. "You're shaking," Roman stated. It wasn't a question. "Low blood sugar." Jesse lied smoothly, instinct taking over. "I haven't eaten breakfast." Roman stared at him for a long, agonizing second. The Alpha's gaze felt like a physical weight pressing down on Jesse's shoulders, demanding compliance, demanding truth. Jesse held his ground, forcing his breathing to slow, staring blankly at the knot he had just tied. "Get out of my way!" Roman finally grunted, apparently dismissing him. Roman stepped past Jesse, his heavy boots echoing on the marble, as he walked toward the front doors. The security guard reached out, pulling the heavy mahogany door open. The cold morning air spilled into the foyer, bringing with it the distant sound of city traffic and the sharp smell of car exhaust. Outside, Donovan stood up a little straighter. He pulled his left hand from his pocket to open the rear door of the town car, but his right hand remained buried deep in his coat. Jesse watched Roman's broad back as the Alpha stepped onto the threshold. "Let him go," a voice in Jesse's head screamed. "Not your circus, not your monkeys. Run to the kitchens, grab your go bag, run." But his feet wouldn't move backward. His eyes were locked on Roman's bad shoulder. The slight limp, the subtle vulnerabilities this monster hid from the world. If he walked out that door, he was dead meat. And Jesse, despite his cynicism, despite the bitter cold shell he had built around his heart to survive this world, realized with a sickening jolt that he couldn't let a man walk to his execution. Not even this one. Jesse moved before his conscious brain gave the order. He darted forward, his soft-soled shoes completely silent on the marble. He reached Roman just as the Alpha stepped onto the front portico. "Wait," Jesse said. He didn't grab Roman's arm. Touching the boss aggressively was a good way to get shot by the door guard, but he stepped right into Roman's blind spot, crowding his personal space again. Roman stopped, turning his head sharply. His eyes were cold, flashing with a dangerous, feral irritation. To anyone else, it looked like the domestic servant was just doing a final check of his boss's appearance. Jesse reached up, his trembling hands grasping the lapels of Roman's suit jacket one more time. He flattened his palms against the wool, feeling the heavy, steady thud of Roman's heart beneath his hands. "Your collar, sir," Jesse said loudly for the benefit of the guard and anyone listening in the courtyard. "It's still uneven." He stepped up on his toes, bringing his face dangerously close to Roman's neck. The scent of ozone and copper was suffocatingly intense here. Roman went rigid, a low warning growl vibrating in his chest. An unmated alpha did not tolerate this level of proximity, especially not from an employee. The tension in Roman's jaw was hard enough to crack bone. Jesse didn't hesitate. He leaned in his lips barely a millimeter from the shell of Roman's ear. "Your driver has a gun." Jesse breathed, his voice so quiet it was entirely lost under the sound of the idling town car engine. "His right coat pocket, chambered and suppressed. Don't get in the car." Jesse pulled back, immediately smoothing his hands down the lapels, giving the suit jacket a final brisk tug. He stepped backward, lowering his head, staring at the floor. He felt sick. His heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Roman did not react, not immediately. There was no gasp, no sudden movement, no reaching for his own weapon. He was a creature raised in a pit of vipers. He knew how to mask a strike. But Jesse felt the change. The shift in the air was absolute. The background radiation of Roman's scent, previously just an aggressive hum of authority, suddenly spiked into something terrifyingly sharp. The copper scent blossomed into the undeniable smell of fresh blood and burning ozone. It was the scent of a predator that had just located its prey. Roman slowly turned his head to look at Jesse. The annoyance in his pale eyes had vanished, replaced by a dark, bottomless calculation. He looked at the Omega not as a maid, not as a piece of furniture, but as a variable, a complication. Jesse kept his head bowed, his hands clasped tightly in front of him, trying to stop the visible shaking. Roman looked away, his gaze shifting out toward the courtyard. He looked at Donovan, who was holding the car door open, a polite, subservient smile plastered on his face. Roman stood on the portico for 3 agonizing seconds. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. "Donovan," Roman called out. His voice was perfectly level, bored even. "Yes, boss." Donovan called back, taking half a step toward the house. Meetings pushed. Roman lied, effortlessly holding the phone to his ear, though the screen was dark. Donovan just called. "The shipment is delayed at the docks. Get the car back in the garage. I'll need you on standby here." Donovan's polite smile faltered for a fraction of a second. It was a micro-expression there and gone, but Jesse saw it. Roman saw it too. "Understood, sir," Donovan said, his voice tightening. "Should I wait in the security office?" "No," Roman said, turning slowly back toward the foyer. "Take the car around to the South Bay. Wait for me there. I need to make a few calls from the study." "Yes, Mr. Gallagher." Donovan closed the car door. He walked around to the driver's side, his right hand finally leaving his pocket to pull the door handle. Roman stepped back inside the house. The heavy mahogany door clicked shut behind him, sealing them in the foyer. The silence returned thicker and heavier than before. Roman slipped his phone back into his pocket. He didn't look at the door guard. He looked entirely at Jesse. "South Bay." Roman murmured, his voice dangerously soft. "There are no cameras in the South Bay." Jesse swallowed hard. He knew that. Everyone on the staff knew that. It was where the family handled internal disputes. Roman took a slow step toward Jesse. The towering alpha loomed over him, effectively pinning Jesse between the credenza and his own massive frame. "How did you know?" Roman asked, the words clipping the air like a blade. I was looking out the window when I tied your tie." Jesse stammered, abandoning the flat, emotionless tone he usually affected. His voice sounded thin, ragged. "I saw him rack the slide. It was suppressed." Roman leaned down, bringing his face level with Jesse's. The Alpha's eyes searched the Omega's pale face, dissecting his fear, looking for deceit. "Why tell me?" Roman whispered. "You hate me. The whole staff hates me. You could have let me walk into a bullet and been free of this place." Jesse looked up, meeting Roman's eyes for the first time. The raw, cynical truth clawed its way up his throat. "Because a dead boss means a turf war." Jesse said, his voice shaking, but strangely defiant. "A turf war means they burn this house down with the staff inside. I don't care about your life, Mr. Gallagher. I care about my paycheck, and I care about waking up tomorrow." Roman stared at him. For a long, breathless moment, the Mafia boss just looked at the trembling, bleach-scented Maid. Then slowly, a low, dark chuckle rumbled in Roman's chest. It wasn't a happy sound. It sounded like gravel being crushed under a tire. "Honesty," Roman murmured, stepping back and adjusting his freshly tied silk knot. "A rare commodity in my house. What's your name, kid?" Jesse Hayes." "Well, Jesse Hayes," Roman said, turning toward the hallway that led to his private study and the gun safe hidden within it. "Go to the kitchen, make yourself a pot of coffee, and whatever you hear from the South Bay in the next 10 minutes, you keep scrubbing the floors." Porcelain struck stainless steel with a sharp, ugly crack. Jesse stared at the fractured rim of the coffee mug, his chest heaving, as if he had just sprinted for miles. His hands were shaking too badly to pour the dark roast. He gave up gripping the edge of the industrial prep counter instead, leaning his weight forward until his wrists burned. Morning prep in the Gallagher kitchen was usually a chaotic symphony of clanking pots shouting chefs, and the heavy comforting smells of yeast and melting butter. Today the massive room was deserted. The head chef wasn't due for another hour, leaving Jesse entirely alone in a cavernous space of cold metal and humming refrigeration units. He tasted blood. He had bitten the inside of his cheek so hard it was bleeding a sharp metallic flavor, mixing with the lingering tinny chemical coating from his suppressant patch. 10 minutes. Roman had told him to scrub the floors for 10 minutes. Jesse kept his eyes fixed on the sweeping second hand of the large analog clock above the double ovens. Every tick felt like a physical strike against his eardrums. He tried to focus on his breathing, on the grit of the tiled floor, on the sterile smell of the industrial sanitizer stinging his nostrils. He tried to rebuild the walls he had just recklessly bulldozed. Not your circus, not your monkeys. The mantra felt pathetic now. He had just handed a man a death sentence. Donovan was a snake, a creeping threat who looked at Omegas like meat, but he was a human being. And Roman Gallagher was currently dismantling him in a concrete garage devoid of cameras. A dull, heavy vibration pulsed through the soles of Jesse's cheap orthopedic work shoes. It wasn't a sound exactly. The South Bay was 2 wings over and 1 level down, insulated by thick retaining walls. But a massive estate like this had bones, steel, I-beams, copper piping, sprawling ventilation shafts. Violence had a frequency. It traveled through the floorboards like a localized tremor. Thud. A pause. A long, agonizing stretch of silence where Jesse forgot how to draw air into his lungs. Thud. Jesse squeezed his eyes shut, his raw fingers digging into the edge of the counter until his knuckles turned bone white. He wasn't a hero. He was a coward who had calculated the odds of his own survival and traded another man's life for it. The cynicism he wore like armor felt terrifyingly thin right now. He had inserted himself into the syndicate's machinery, and the gears were grinding right beneath his feet. The heavy swinging doors of the kitchen pushed open with a squeak of hinges. Jesse flinched, spinning around his hand, instinctively grabbing the handle of a paring knife left near the cutting boards. Roman Gallagher stood in the doorway. The Alpha looked entirely different than he had in the foyer 15 minutes ago. The charcoal suit jacket was gone. His crisp white dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, the cuffs rolled up past his forearms. And the tie. The dark blue silk tie Jesse had carefully knotted was hanging loose, ruined and deeply stained with something dark and wet near the bottom edge. Roman didn't say a word. He walked into the kitchen, his heavy boots making slow, deliberate scuffs against the linoleum. The air in the room instantly curdled. The scent of ozone and dark coffee was entirely eclipsed by the raw, suffocating stench of adrenaline, extreme exertion, and hot, fresh blood. It was a primal, territorial odor that slammed into Jesse's suppressed biology like a freight train. Jesse's body reacted before his brain could stop it. His knees unlocked. A deep involuntary submission reflex hardwired into his genetics pulled him downward. He caught himself on the counter, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps, fighting the overwhelming biological urge to bare his neck to the apex predator in the room. Roman stopped at the industrial sink a few feet away. He turned the heavy brass faucet, the water rushing out in a harsh torrent. He shoved his hands under the stream. The water running down the stainless steel drain turned a violent, rusted pink. Jesse stared at Roman's hands. The Alpha's knuckles were split and bleeding, the skin torn over the joints. A dark smear of crimson stained his left forearm, drying into a crust against the dark hair of his arm. Donovan had a contact in the O'Bannon family, Roman said. His voice was completely flat, devoid of any adrenaline or triumph. He sounded like a man reading a grocery list. They paid him $200,000 to put a hollow point in the base of my skull. He was going to leave my body in the trunk at the docks. Jesse couldn't speak. He gripped the paring knife behind his back, his palms slick with cold sweat. Roman grabbed a stack of rough paper towels, aggressively drying his hands. He winced slightly, his left shoulder dropping a fraction of an inch, the old bullet wound protesting the sudden extreme violence. He threw the bloodied towels into the bin and finally turned his pale, exhausting gaze onto Jesse. "You didn't make the coffee," Roman observed, nodding toward the empty pot. I dropped the mug." Jesse managed to choke out, hating how small his voice sounded. Roman walked toward him. Jesse pressed his spine against the counter, his knuckles white around the hidden knife. He could smell the iron on Roman's skin mixed with a cold, terrifying calm. Roman stopped a foot away, crowding Jesse's space, just as Jesse had crowded his in the foyer. Roman reached out. Jesse flinched violently, bracing for a strike. Instead, Roman's thick, bruised fingers brushed against the collar of Jesse's cheap cotton uniform. He wasn't hurting him. He was straightening the lapel, his movements surprisingly precise despite the damage to his knuckles. "You have a terrible survival instinct, Jesse Hayes," Roman murmured, looking down into Jesse's wide, panicked eyes. "You saved my life to save your paycheck. Pragmatic. Cold. I respect that. But you forgot the second half of the equation." "What equation?" Jesse whispered, his heart hammering against his ribs. "The one where you don't exist anymore," Roman said softly. "Ghosts don't pull mob bosses off the execution block. You stepped into the light. Now I see you." Bleach couldn't scrub away the reality of the situation. Jesse spent the next 2 hours on his hands and knees in the secondary dining room, a wire brush in his hand and a bucket of scalding, chemical-laced water by his side. He scrubbed the baseboards until his shoulders screamed and the skin on his palms felt raw and blistering. Physical pain was a grounding mechanism. It kept the panic from swallowing him whole. He was compromised. For 3 years, his defense mechanism had been complete aggressive anonymity. He kept his head down, took his suppressants religiously, despite the bone aches and the nausea, and never made eye contact with the men who carried guns. He was just a shape moving through the periphery of their violent lives. Now Roman Gallagher knew his name. Worse, Roman Gallagher owed him a debt. In the underworld, debts were not favors. They were chains. Jesse dipped the brush into the murky water, the sharp sting of the bleach biting into a microscopic cut on his thumb. He hissed, sitting back on his heels, wiping his forehead with the back of his wrist. The door to the dining room clicked open. Jesse froze, the brush dripping gray water onto the hardwood. He didn't look up instinctively, dropping his chin to his chest, adopting the posture of a servant waiting to be dismissed. "Stop that." It was Roman. The Alpha's voice was rougher than it had been in the kitchen sandpaper dragging over wood. Jesse slowly lifted his head. Roman had changed clothes. He wore a simple black crew-neck sweater and dark slacks, the informal attire making his massive frame look even broader, less constrained by the civilized tailoring of his suits. He had a fresh bandage wrapped tightly around his right knuckles. The scent of blood was gone, replaced once again by the heavy, oppressive ozone and cedar, though a sharp undercurrent of exhaustion laced the air. "Sir," Jesse asked, keeping his tone blank. "I said stop scrubbing," Roman ordered, crossing the room and pulling out one of the heavy mahogany dining chairs. He sank into it heavily, rubbing a hand over his face. He looked 10 years older than he had that morning. "It smells like a chemical fire in here. Leave the bucket." Jesse hesitated, then slowly placed the brush down. He stayed on his knees. Standing up felt too aggressive, too exposed. "The security team is pulling Donovan's quarters apart," Roman said, staring sightlessly at the ornate crystal chandelier hanging above the table. "They found a burner phone, wire transfers. The O'Bannons have been cultivating him for 6 months. 6 months he's been driving me, knowing exactly when he was going to pull the trigger." Roman shifted his gaze down to Jesse. The Alpha's eyes were stripped of their usual cold armor. They looked hollow, paranoid. "My head of transit security." Roman muttered a bitter, self-deprecating smile, pulling at the corner of his mouth. "The man who practically slept outside my door. Bought and paid for. Makes you wonder who else in this house is waiting for a wire transfer." Jesse felt a cold bead of sweat roll down his spine. The suppressant patch on his neck suddenly felt like it was burning through his skin. His biology, stressed to the breaking point by adrenaline and proximity to a distressed alpha, was fighting the chemicals. He swallowed hard-tasting tin. "I just cleaned the floors, Mr. Gallagher," Jesse said quietly, desperately trying to reestablish his boundary. "I don't know anything about the staff." "Bullshit." Roman snapped the sudden volume, making Jesse flinch. Roman leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his massive shoulders hunched. "You saw a slide rack from 20 yards away through a pane of reinforced glass. You noticed an assassin when my entire security detail saw a driver holding a door. You don't just clean floors, Jesse. You watch. You survive." Jesse didn't answer. He couldn't. Roman was dissecting him, peeling back the layers of his camouflage with terrifying accuracy. "My circle is compromised," Roman continued, his voice dropping back to a low, dangerous rumble. "I can't trust my betas. I can't trust the alphas on my payroll because they're always looking for a throat to tear out to move up the ladder. I need someone in my periphery who isn't playing the game." "I am not playing any game," Jesse said, his voice trembling slightly with genuine anger. "I'm trying to pay my rent, sir. That's it." "Then consider this a promotion," Roman said flatly. Jesse stared at him, his stomach dropping into a bottomless abyss. "What?" "You're done with the baseboards," Roman commanded, standing up from the chair. The sheer physical presence of the man swallowed the room. "You're moving out of the servants' quarters. You'll take the room adjacent to my study on the second floor. You are now my personal attendant. You handle my food, my schedule, my clothes." "No." The word slipped out of Jesse's mouth before his self-preservation instincts could catch it. Roman stopped. The air in the dining room turned to glass. The ozone scent spiked sharp and punishing. Jesse scrambled to his feet, wiping his wet, raw hands furiously on his apron. He was shaking, but a desperate cornered defiance flared in his chest. "I am an omega on suppressants," Jesse said, his voice cracking, shedding the flat monotone entirely. "I am a liability. I am a target. If you pull me out of the general staff and put me next to you, you put a target on my back. Everyone in this house will think they'll think we're—" He couldn't even finish the sentence. The implication of an omega suddenly elevated to the boss's side was universally understood in their world. And it was a death sentence. "They'll think you're my whore," Roman supplied brutally, not flinching from the word. "They'll think I finally snapped and took a suppressed domestic worker as a plaything." Jesse's breath hitched. "Yes. And then they will use me to get to you. I won't do it. Fire me. Kill me if you have to tie up loose ends, but I won't be your human shield." Roman looked at him. The alpha didn't look angry. He looked fascinated. The cold, calculating predator in Roman was assessing Jesse's outburst, weighing the raw, unpolished defiance against the trembling hands and the terrified eyes. "I'm not asking you to be a shield, Jesse," Roman said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly soft register as he took a slow step forward, closing the distance between them. "I'm asking you to be exactly what you are, a ghost who sees everything. You saved my life because it benefited your survival. Now I'm tying your survival directly to mine." Roman reached out, his knuckles wrapped in white gauze brushing against the side of Jesse's neck, stopping millimeters from the edge of the flesh-colored suppressant patch. Jesse froze, his heart slamming into his ribs. "You want to live?" Roman whispered, leaning down so his face was level with Jesse's, the heat of his skin radiating like an open flame. "Then you make sure I live. Pack your things. You move upstairs tonight." Packing took exactly 4 minutes. Jesse owned 3 uniform shirts, 2 pairs of trousers, a half-empty box of generic suppressants, and a toothbrush. He didn't have mementos. Mementos were anchors, and anchors drowned you in this kind of life. He shoved the meager pile into a canvas duffel bag, pulling the zipper closed with a harsh grating sound that echoed in the cramped basement quarters. The walk from the subterranean staff wing to the second floor was a gauntlet. News in the Gallagher estate didn't travel. It metabolized. By the time Jesse slung his bag over his shoulder and stepped into the fluorescent-lit corridor, the entire domestic staff already knew. They didn't know about Donovan or the gun or the blood washing down the industrial sink. They only knew that the invisible bleach-scented Omega was moving upstairs, to the boss's wing. Nobody spoke to him. The silence was worse than shouting. A beta named Clara, a woman who usually saved Jesse the burnt ends of the sourdough loaves, stood by the laundry bins. As Jesse passed, she didn't look at his face. She looked at his neck right at the edge of his collar, where the suppressant patch hid, and then she deliberately turned her head and spat a glob of saliva onto the concrete floor, inches from his cheap shoes. Jesse didn't break his stride. He kept his eyes locked straight ahead, his jaw clamped shut so tightly his teeth ground together. "They think you're a whore." Roman's words rang in his ears, a brutal ringing truth. In their eyes, he had traded his body for a private bathroom and silk sheets. He was a traitor to the working class of the house, a climber who had spread his legs for a monster. Defending himself was impossible. Telling them he was actually a hostage, a fleshy security camera drafted into a mob war, would only get them all killed. He climbed the back stairs. The environment shifted with every step, the architecture literally elevating him into a different world. The raw concrete and buzzing fluorescence gave way to plush, sound-dampening wool carpets and warm, recessed amber lighting. The smell of industrial sanitizer faded, replaced by the scent of lemon oil old paper and the suffocating, omnipresent musk of Roman Gallagher. Jesse's new room was through a heavy oak door adjacent to the master study. He pushed it open and stood on the threshold, the canvas strap of his bag cutting into his shoulder. The room was twice the size of his old one. It had a queen-sized bed with an absurd amount of pillows, heavy velvet drapes, and a private adjoining bathroom tiled in slate. It was beautiful. It was a cage. He dropped his bag. It hit the thick carpet with a pathetic, muffled thud. Jesse walked straight to the bathroom. He gripped the edges of the marble sink, staring at his reflection in the pristine mirror. He looked pale, exhausted, and terrifyingly fragile. His hands reached up, fingers hooking under the edge of the flesh-colored patch on his neck. He ripped it off in one sharp motion. He hissed as the adhesive tore at his irritated skin. A red, raw square marked the injection site, the flesh inflamed from 3 years of continuous chemical bombardment. Without the patch, a terrifying wave of vertigo washed over him. The sudden absence of the heavy synthetic depressants made his nerve-endings scream. His natural scent, something faint like crushed dry leaves and rain, tried to push through weak and confused. He couldn't afford it. He couldn't afford to feel. Jesse fumbled with his canvas bag, ripping open a new foil packet. His hands shook violently as he slapped the fresh suppressant patch over the raw skin. The chemicals bit into his bloodstream with a vicious, icy burn. He gripped the sink, squeezing his eyes shut, panting through his teeth, until the tinny taste coated the back of his throat and the dull, emotional Novocaine settled over his brain once more. Only then did he walk back into the bedroom. He didn't look at the massive, inviting bed. Instead, he pulled one thin blanket from the mattress, laid it out on the floor between the wardrobe and the wall, and curled his body into a tight defensive knot on the hard wood. 2 days blurred into a hostile, paranoid purgatory. Jesse's duties had mutated into a bizarre pantomime of servitude. He still wore his black and white uniform, but he no longer scrubbed floors or polished silver. He stood in the corners of rooms. He poured coffee. He existed in the suffocating gravitational pull of Roman Gallagher, waiting for the other shoe to drop. It dropped on Thursday night at 2:14 a.m. The heavy connecting door between Jesse's room and Roman's private study swung open without a knock. Jesse, dozing fitfully on the floor, bolted upright, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Roman stood in the doorway, silhouetted by the dim desk lamp behind him. The alpha looked wrecked. He was in his undershirt, his suspenders hanging loose at his hips. The bandage on his right hand was gone, revealing swollen purple knuckles coated in a shiny layer of antibiotic ointment. The scent rolling off him was a toxic cloud of sour mash whiskey, burnt tobacco, and an underlying ragged frustration. "Get up!" Roman rasped. Jesse scrambled to his feet, kicking the blanket aside, instantly smoothing down his wrinkled uniform shirt. "Sir, do you need a medic? I need you to look at something." Roman turned and walked back into the study, leaving the door open. Jesse hesitated, his bare feet cold against the floorboards, before following. The study was a disaster. The massive mahogany desk, usually meticulously organized, was buried under stacks of manila folders, financial ledgers, and loose photographs. An empty crystal tumbler sat precariously near the edge. The air in the room was so thick with alpha pheromones that Jesse's suppressed biology actually protested, a dull, nauseating ache blossoming behind his eyes. Roman leaned over the desk, bracing his weight on his good hand, and tapped a thick file with a bruised index finger. "Personnel files," Roman said, his voice raw. "Everyone who works in this house. Guards, drivers, cooks, maids. 112 people." Jesse stopped a few feet from the desk, wrapping his arms around his own torso, shivering slightly despite the warmth of the room. "Why are you showing me this? Because Donovan didn't operate in a vacuum." Roman snarled, suddenly sweeping a stack of papers off the desk. They fluttered to the Persian rug like dead birds. "The O'Bannons knew my schedule. They knew the blind spots in the courtyard cameras. They knew my head of security was vulnerable to a bribe. That takes inside information, prolonged observation." Roman pushed away from the desk, stalking toward a heavy crystal decanter on a side table. He poured 3 fingers of amber liquid into a new glass. His left shoulder was noticeably stiff, his movements jagged and angry. "Someone else in this house is feeding them intel," Roman said, taking a long pull of the whiskey. He turned his pale, bloodshot eyes on Jesse. "And my betas are utterly useless. They're too busy kissing my boots to see who's holding the knife behind my back. But you—" Roman walked slowly back toward Jesse. The alpha was a towering wall of muscle and menace, his sheer physical density forcing Jesse to take a half step backward. "You survived in this house for 3 years by being invisible," Roman said, stopping just inches away. The smell of the alcohol on his breath mingled with the sharp ozone, dizzying and potent. "You know the rhythms. You know who complains about money in the kitchens. You know who makes phone calls from the pantry at midnight. You hear the whispers I don't." Jesse's stomach hollowed out. The cold dread he had felt in the foyer returned tenfold. "You want me to rat out the staff?" Jesse whispered, his voice trembling. "I want you to save your own skin," Roman corrected brutally. "If the O'Bannons breach this house, do you think they'll spare you? You're the boss's new pet Omega. They'll mount your head on a pike right next to mine." "I am not your pet." Jesse snapped, a sudden blinding spike of anger cutting through the terror. He tilted his chin up, forcing himself to meet Roman's gaze. "I am a hostage. Don't dress this up as a partnership. You dragged me into this." Roman's eyes darkened, the pupils blowing wide. The air pressure in the room seemed to drop, the alpha dominance rolling off him in heavy, suffocating waves. A lesser Omega unmedicated would have hit their knees. Jesse swayed his knees, buckling slightly, but he locked his joints, digging his fingernails into his own palms to stay upright. Hostage, employee, pet. Call it whatever helps you sleep at night," Roman murmured, leaning down, his voice a dangerous velvet purr. "But you are going to look through those files. You're going to tell me whose debts don't line up with their salaries. You're going to tell me who looks at the security cameras instead of the floor, because if you don't—" Roman reached out his bruised thumb, gently tracing the line of Jesse's jaw. The contrast between the violent damage of his hand and the feather-light touch sent a violent, contradictory shudder through Jesse's entire body. "If you don't—" Roman finished, his breath hot against Jesse's cheek. "I won't have a house left to pay your wages." Roman pulled his hand back, leaving a burning trail of heat on Jesse's skin. He turned his back, returning to his whiskey, dismissing Jesse with a sharp wave of his hand. "Start with the kitchen staff," Roman ordered, staring out the darkened window into the courtyard. Leave the files on my desk by morning. Jesse stood frozen for a long moment, staring at the broad, scarred back of the Mafia boss. He looked at the files scattered across the desk, files containing the lives of the people who spat at his feet, the people who ignored him, the people he had worked alongside for years. With a shaking hand, Jesse reached out and picked up the first folder. Manila folders smelled like stale paper glue and the sterile dust of a filing cabinet. It was a dry, dead scent that coated the back of Jesse's throat, completely at odds with the heavy living musk of the Alpha, sleeping mere feet away. Roman had collapsed onto the leather Chesterfield sofa in the corner of the study around 4 a.m. He hadn't asked for a blanket. He hadn't even taken off his boots. He simply hit a wall of biological exhaustion, his massive body shutting down to repair the trauma of the day. His breathing was a low, rhythmic rasp, interrupted occasionally by a sharp intake of air when his injured shoulder shifted against the leather. Jesse sat at the enormous mahogany desk, the green glass banker's lamp casting a jaundiced pool of light over stacks of personnel files. His eyes burned. They felt full of sand grating with every blink. His hand, still raw and flaking from the morning's bleach, trembled slightly as he turned another page. The heat in the room was stifling. Jesse's new suppressant patch was working, but his body was fighting a war of attrition. Proximity to a stressed bleeding alpha was a biological trigger for an omega-A, deeply ingrained evolutionary command to soothe, to nest, to submit. The synthetic chemicals in his bloodstream acted like a dam against that instinct, but the pressure was immense. He felt feverish. A dull, throbbing ache rooted itself at the base of his skull. He forced himself to focus on the numbers. Roman had been right. The betrayal wasn't born from malice. It was born from leverage. Jesse dragged a thick black marker down the columns of bank statements, comparing them to shift schedules. He wasn't a forensic accountant. He was a survivor. And survivors knew how to look for desperation. He found it at 5:17 a.m. The name on the tab was Martin Foster, the head valet, a beta. Jesse stared at the black and white photograph clipped to the inside cover. Martin had kind eyes. He was one of the few upper-level staff members who didn't treat the cleaning crew like stray dogs. 2 winters ago, when the heating in the basement quarters had failed, Martin had quietly left 3 heavy wool blankets outside Jesse's door. He had never asked for thanks. He had never mentioned it. Jesse's stomach churned a sudden, violently sour wave of nausea, hitting him. He swallowed hard-tasting bile and tin. He looked at the financial records. Martin's younger sister had early-onset dementia. She was housed in a state-run facility on the south side. But 4 months ago, there was a transfer. A private, highly exclusive care facility in the mountains. The monthly tuition was double Martin's annual salary. Then came the schedule cross-reference. Martin was the valet. He handled the cars. He handled the coats. He was the one who handed Roman his briefcase every morning. He knew Roman's exact itinerary down to the minute. He knew Donovan. And yesterday morning, the morning of the hit, Martin had called in sick at 4 a.m. with a sudden stomach flu. He couldn't be here to watch it happen. Jesse realized the thought a cold, heavy stone dropping into his gut. He sold the schedule to the O'Bannons to pay for his sister's care, but he didn't have the stomach to look Roman in the eye before he died. Jesse closed the folder. The cardboard cover slapped against the desk with a sharp damning sound. He had it. The proof. The key to his own survival in this gilded cage. All he had to do was hand this file to the monster sleeping on the sofa, and his debt would be paid. Roman would be safe. Jesse would be safe. But Martin would be dead. Jesse stood up his chair, scraping loudly against the Persian rug. The sound didn't wake Roman, but the alpha shifted, a low growl vibrating in his chest. Jesse backed away from the desk, wrapping his arms around his own ribs. He felt like he was suffocating. He walked to the heavy floor-to-ceiling windows, pressing his hot forehead against the cold, reinforced glass. Outside, the sky was beginning to bruise, a dark, bruised purple bleeding into the horizon. The courtyard was empty. If he burned the file, Roman would eventually find out. The Mafia boss would hire outside auditors, tear the staff apart piece by piece until he found the leak. By hiding it, Jesse would make himself complicit in the assassination attempt. Roman would kill him. Slowly. If he handed over the file, he was pulling the trigger on a man who had once kept him from freezing to death. "You're crying." The voice was rough-rusted from sleep and alcohol. Jesse flinched, wiping his face furiously with the back of his sleeve. He hadn't even realized tears were leaking from his eyes. He turned around. Roman was sitting up on the sofa. He looked terrible. His skin was gray, the dark shadows under his eyes looking like physical bruises. He was leaning forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his gaze locked on Jesse. "I'm not crying," Jesse lied, his voice cracking violently. "It's the dust. The files." Roman didn't argue. He slowly pushed himself up from the sofa, grunting as his bad shoulder took the weight. He walked over to the desk, his bare feet silent on the rug. He looked at the single closed file resting in the center of the leather blotter. Roman reached out and flipped it open. Jesse couldn't watch. He turned his face back to the window, staring blankly at the brick wall of the courtyard. The silence in the room stretched heavy and terrible. The only sound was the faint rhythmic rustle of Roman turning the pages, checking the bank statements, reading the sisters' medical records, connecting the dots. "Martin," Roman murmured softly. It wasn't an exclamation of surprise. It was an acknowledgement, a weary, heavy acceptance of a familiar betrayal. "He did it for his sister," Jesse whispered to the glass, hating how small, how desperate his voice sounded. "He didn't want your territory, Mr. Gallagher. He just wanted to keep her safe." "I know," Roman said. Jesse turned to look at him. Roman was staring at Martin's photograph, his face a terrifyingly blank mask. "Does that matter?" Jesse asked, the cynicism finally breaking, leaving behind raw, bleeding desperation. "Does the why matter at all?" Roman looked up. The Alpha's pale eyes met Jesse's red-rimmed ones. "No, Jesse, it doesn't. A bullet fired out of love kills you just as dead as one fired out of hate." Roman picked up the heavy brass telephone on the desk. He didn't dial. He just pressed a single button connecting directly to the security detail in the basement. It's Roman," he said, his voice flat, devoid of any emotion. "Go to Martin Foster's apartment, pull him out of bed, bring him to the South Bay. Don't let him make any phone calls." Roman hung up the phone. The click of the receiver sounded like a gavel falling. The morning sun finally crested the perimeter walls, casting long, harsh shadows across the Gallagher estate. The golden hour light offered no warmth. It just illuminated the cold, unforgiving architecture of the syndicate's headquarters. Jesse stood paralyzed in the center of the study. He felt like his blood had been replaced with ice water. Roman walked around the desk. He stopped in front of Jesse. The Alpha was immense, a towering monument to violence. But for a fractured second, Jesse saw the profound, crushing isolation radiating off him. Being the apex predator meant you were always alone. It meant everyone around you was either prey, a threat, or a weapon waiting to be used. And Jesse had just allowed himself to become a weapon. "You did the right thing," Roman said. His voice was quieter now, a low rumble designed to soothe, though it had the opposite effect. "I killed him," Jesse whispered, looking down at his own trembling hands. They looked exactly the same. Raw knuckles, short nails, but they felt permanently stained. "I might as well have put the gun to his head myself." "You saved my life." "Again," Roman corrected, reaching out. Jesse tried to step back, but his body betrayed him. The biological command of the Alpha's proximity combined with the sheer exhaustion of the night rooted him to the spot. Roman's hand, heavy and warm, cupped the side of Jesse's neck, his thumb resting gently against the edge of the new suppressant patch. "You think you're a monster now?" Roman murmured, leaning down, his scent, dark coffee ozone, and a terrifying possessive warmth enveloping Jesse entirely. "You think you crossed a line and you can never go back to scrubbing floors and pretending you don't exist. You're right." Jesse squeezed his eyes shut, a single tear escaping and tracking down his pale cheek. Roman's thumb moved, catching the tear before it reached his jaw. The world doesn't reward the innocent Jesse, Roman whispered fiercely, his breath ghosting across Jesse's ear. It grinds them into dust. You survived today because you were smart, and because you were ruthless enough to hand me that file. Don't apologize for surviving. I hate you. Jesse choked out his hands, balling into fists at his sides. He didn't move away from the touch. The contradiction tore at his sanity. He hated the man, but his biology, suppressed and starving, was desperate for the Alpha's grounding heat. I know, Roman said, a dark, genuine smile touching his lips for the first time. I prefer it that way. Hate is honest. Hate keeps you sharp. Roman pulled his hand back, the absence of his touch, leaving a cold, aching void against Jesse's skin. The Alpha turned and walked toward the heavy double doors of the study, adjusting his cuffs, transforming back into the untouchable boss of the Gallagher Syndicate. Get some sleep, Jesse, Roman ordered, not looking back as he opened the door. Tonight you're learning how to read the shipping manifests. The door clicked shut. Jesse was alone. He stood in the quiet study for a long time, listening to the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Slowly, mechanically, he walked over to the mahogany desk. He picked up the empty coffee mug Roman had left behind, feeling the residual warmth of the ceramic against his cold palms. He looked out the window one last time. Down in the courtyard, two heavy-set alphas in dark suits were dragging a struggling, terrified Martin Foster toward the concrete ramp of the South Bay garage. Jesse watched until they disappeared into the shadows. Then he turned away from the window, walked into his new luxurious bedroom, and began to make the bed. He pulled the silk sheets tight, smoothing out the wrinkles with his raw, blistering hands. He was still a domestic worker. He was still cleaning up the Gallagher estate. But he wasn't a ghost anymore. He was part of the machine. Did Jesse make the right choice? Trading a life in the shadows for a seat at the devil's table? When survival demands you become the very thing you hate, is there any coming back? Let us know your thoughts on Jesse's brutal decision in the comments below. If this raw, gritty Omegaverse story kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you never miss an episode of our dark romance series.